Cool. Hey everyone, this is the SIG Auth meeting for June 10th, 2020. Not that much on the agenda, but let's get started. So I wanted to point out for the polls of note, Jordan has been doing a lot of work on getting the CSR API ready for V1, and I see that a lot of the stuff that he had open has, I think, since merged. Jordan, are you on the call? Did you want to point out anything? Is there anything in particular you need assistance on? I know you need people to go review stuff and help answer.
I think it's actually David and Munners and you and Sean did a pretty good job reviewing stuff from Cube Control and controller and stuff. So after this PR is in, we actually will have like all the pieces needed to do end-to-end only state of V1 APIs, which is pretty cool. So the conformance GA only CI job we can flip to actually only GA features and APIs, which is awesome.
Hey, awesome. How many years did this take?
Too many.
Awesome. Okay. Do you need anything in particular from anyone on this? Or are we good to make sure we get CSR to V1 in 119?
It's on a good track. I think the next step will be sweeping the in progress documentation PR. So I will probably ping the channel to see if anyone wants to help. There are 2 or 3 pages. One is sort of cluster admin facing, one is user facing. So if we get help or eyes on that, that's kind of the last piece for 119 for this.
Cool. Otherwise, for 119, the other thing that, and you guys can remind me if I'm forgetting, the other bit was trying to get exec to GA. We'll see if that happens. In terms of PRs that are open, I have one open for wiring in the cluster information. Andrew had one for the install hint. Andrew's had one open to fix a bug in relation to like token interaction. We need to do docs PRs to update docs to line up with what the KEP actually says is the API, as well as then like there's outstanding tests that need to be written, and the API actually has to be revved to V1.
Is there a project or a list of
I can link in there. I have a issue on KK that is where I wrote down all the things that were left. So yeah, I'll link that in. I'll update the agenda to have that. I'm a little skeptical we can get all of this in for 119, mostly because like there's a significant amount of testing that I think is still left as like part of the GA requirement. So I suspect the order needs to be get all like the bugs fixed and the tests in, and then you make a V1 API, not the other way around, because that gives you false impression of it is done. So it's all right. If it doesn't make it, it doesn't make it. But you know, we know what we need to do, and I don't think there's like outstanding like I want this API to do this thing, and it doesn't do it. So that's there. I think we can go on to discussion topics now. I will actually hold mine for a bit, mostly because it might take up the whole time, or maybe not. And I was going to let Liz and like Aiden, I think you guys had opened these questions. So if you would like to go ahead and ask those, the set of people that probably know the answers are in this call, or there are no people.
That's good to know. Yeah, so hi there. I'm Aiden. I'm anchor on an engineering team, and we're doing a little bit of research into Kate secrets, partially because we see a little bit of a gap there around the generation of certain secret types and the rotation of them on the platform. And we when digging into them, we did notice that there's a couple of extra secret types that are not really well documented, such as like basic auth or TLS or things like that. We mostly just see people using opaque everywhere as kind of the type of secret. We weren't sure if there's much like historical context around why these secrets were added, and like what was the target audience, what problem were we trying to solve, and like is there a future for them?
Yeah, so secrets are just sort of a bucket of bytes. They're not structured. It's just key value, and so whatever meaning those keys and those values have has to be agreed on between the thing producing a secret and the thing consuming a secret. And so the secret type was a way to identify a particular sort of agreed on meaning for keys. So it may have been the first one, probably the first one was the service account secret. So if you have a secret that is of type Kubernetes IO service account, the thing generating that is going to create 3 keys: a namespace key, a ca.cert key, and a token key. And it's going to populate those with the current namespace, a certificate bundle to talk to the API server, and a token credential to use against the API server. And so the type lets someone who's reading the secret understand what keys it can expect and what the meaning of those keys are. And for a controller that is going to be maintaining that secret or listing, filtering, you can use the secret type as a field selector in API calls. So other examples of secret types are the ones you mentioned, like TLS, where you're expected to have 2 keys, one of which, key is overloaded, 2 items in the data map, one of which is a certificate and one of which is the private key associated with that certificate. Other examples are some of the secrets that the storage volume provisioning paths use, where a persistent volume or a storage class, I think, can reference a secret that should be used, to make storage system calls. And for that one in particular, we used the secret type. We required that the credentials associated with a particular volume provisioner have a secret type that indicated it was for that provisioner. And the goal there was to make sure that the person who's putting data into this secret intends that data to be used for volume provisioning purposes and sent to this volume provisioner. And so if you look at the persistent volume provisioner, it will follow the reference to grab the data out of the secret to use those credentials, but it will make sure that the type of the secret matches the volume type. And the goal there was to prevent like a confused WD where someone points at a secret that actually wasn't intended to be sent to this volume system, and the data gets pulled out of a secret and sent to some remote system. Does that help? Are there follow-up questions?
That does help a lot.
That's history. Do you remember the discussion around duck typing? And should a secret be allowed to have multiple types from years back?
Multiple types.
Right. So if you contain the fields for basic auth and for TLS, or can you later grow the TLS fields? I remember talking about that with Eric Toon some time ago, measured in years. And if we had a secrets v2, that's a thing I would be interested in pursuing.
David, if I understand what you said, was it so that you could grow the use of a secret over time without breaking backwards compatibility?
So that you can describe, I have one secret that can fulfill these different things. I have a TLS key and a kube config in me, right? Like there are many times I wish I had a kube config secret type because it's pretty common, right? There are also times I wish I had a similar field on config maps to say this one contains CA bundles in a CA bundle in a well-known location. Anyway, it's helpful for describing what things are, but it has some limitations. You can't validate these things.
Right. That's the thing. It's a convention. It's not enforced server side generally. It's certainly not for types that aren't Kubernetes specific.
Well, admission can do some things because it's an immutable field. So intercepting creation allows you to require fields be present when they're created, and intercepting updates ensures they don't go away.
No.
This kind of vaguely relates. I haven't had a chance to actually read the PR/issue, but someone had opened up something about adding to the TLS secret type a field for CA, and I just hadn't had a chance to think about it or even figure out what the use case was. But it sort of is related to like growing things over time.
Yeah. Well, we can't change the API now, so.
Let me know if there are other questions or anything else that would be helpful. And if we want to fold some of this explanation back into the field documentation, that could be fun.
So I guess it doesn't sound like there would be any maybe specific harm or benefit to using these types if we were. It's mostly just for us being able to like filter on controllers or
being able to filter and being able to indicate the expected keys and the meaning of those keys. That's the purpose.
And I think, as Jordan said, the whole confused deputy case in terms of like some privileged component reading a secret and then handing it off somewhere else, having some light authorization in a sense, or like making sure that the intent was clear. I think
less authorization and more intent.
Yeah, I think oddity is probably the wrong word, but like I don't think any of that hurts. But as we mentioned, all of this is convention, right? Nothing is being enforced unless you go enforce it using some kind of admission yourself, which you could. There's no reason that if you have a controller that manages a particular type that it can't also be bundled with matching admission. It seems reasonable.
Thank you. Does anyone? I know Liz is here and Jake's here as well. Do you have any other questions on that?
Just kind of more generally, have you seen using the types? Have you seen a lot of people asking questions about types, or has it been kind of a quieter usage?
I don't see a lot. The issue that Mo mentioned around some of the use for TLS bits, I think a couple of the ingress controllers had types mentioned in their documentation, but I'm not quite sure. Like sort of a secret that they expected to have, not just a certificate, but also maybe a bundle for doing client validation. So that's a perfectly legitimate use. Like if your controller wants certain content in a secret and you define it and you put a domain name you control and you say example.com/myTLS bundle, like this is a signal to us that we should look for these things and interpret these things this way. That's perfectly fine.
This is more of a question to just say, long term, do we see some path of like having a more, like a stronger story on storing secrets in CRDs, like things around like encryption at rest. Because if you like, I would not suggest to folks like on the call that you should start making like a custom CRD type for a different kind of secret, because as far as I know today, you can't target like various compliance requirements to make sure that at rest those secrets are correctly protected. So you might get a lot of like cool stuff like schema validation and enforcement of structure and all those other things, but you might not be able to sell your product.
I remember a discussion a while back around some way to indicate that a particular resource was considered confidential and should be encrypted.
Right. With
I don't
audit.
think it happened on that, but I don't think objection to it hadn't been prioritized.
We reached agreement in API machinery that such a thing was acceptable, right? But we weren't going to prioritize working on it.
I can try to find the discussion and link to it in case people want to see where we ended up.
David, on the API machinery bit, did you guys like sort of write down what subset of things you were happy with? Like just was it just like the idea was okay, and then
it was that the idea was okay, right? That you could have the notion of confidentiality, and there was a question about whether it would be something just on a CRD or whether it would be exposed via discovery, since there are auditing implications, right? And then whether keys themselves, like the names of the types, were confidential in addition to the contents, because for audit, if the name being confidential causes problems tracking metadata. Obviously, for storage, since the keys themselves in etcd are not encrypted, just the content, as I recall, you're permanently facing problems there.
As far as I remember, we don't have any way today to handle I want the actual key in the etcd key path to be encrypted.
None that I know.
I linked to I think the API machinery discussion you were talking about, David. Was there a very brief mention? Maybe there was more in the recording of that meeting. I don't.
It's been a very long time. I think it was fairly quick in terms of like, is it reasonable? Yeah, it's probably reasonable. Would we devote review time to it? Probably. Would we devote development time to it? No one had time to go look at it.
Okay. So yeah, so I linked to the meeting where that was discussed.
I guess Aiden, Jacob, I could say that like if such a thing interests you, I think we would certainly review a CAP and do those things. I think there is a desire long term to have those things. It's just we have to find cycles to get to it at some point. Cool. Did you guys have other questions?
Hello, I'm thinking of a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Bruce. I work with Aiden and Liz and the CredHub team. One thing about those types, those secret types that I had in mind was that my first thought is that I don't like too much that they contain non-secret information. Like for example, there's the type that like has a username and a password. And I wish it was formatted in a different way or organized in a different way, that the username is not in the secret table. Okay, one of the arguments that I have is that I've seen people getting confused. So for example, my main example is the like private key and certificate thing. And people are not too familiar with, like public key cryptography or with certificates. And so they see this thing and it's like, okay, all this stuff is private. And then we tell them, no, certificates are actually a public thing. It's okay to share it. And so after that, people think, oh, okay, so this thing is public. And so they start sharing everything and they end up sharing the private key because it's part of the certificate object. And so I've seen that, and so I'm wondering if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think it's like ease of use, coherence of configuration, being able to refer to a single object instead of two objects. I mean, if someone wants to create separate, like a config map to hold their certificate and a secret to hold their private key, they certainly can. But I don't think it's particularly important to distinguish between those. Just in the interest of time, I know it's like 2:25, and we do have several other things on the agenda. So, like, if there's discussion about like how to use secrets, maybe that would be a good thing to take offline, so we can be sure to get to the other items.
Cool. All right. All right.
Okay. That's me. Can you hear me?
Sure. I'll let you go. I saw you add this. I was like, this is a small question. We can answer this question.
Yeah. So a little bit of background. In 1.18, the service account issuer discovery feature get was added to the API server, which adds OpenID Connect discovery endpoint to the API server. And normally there is no, for example, a row binding associated with it. And normally the end users have to add, for example, the authenticated users or anonymous users in order to be accessible by everyone. However, if the anonymous authentication flag is set false to the API server, it's not actually possible to access it in any means. And the main problem is that a lot of client libraries are already using, I mean, they assume that this endpoint is not behind any authentication or authorization, and a lot of those have to be changed. So my question is there any possibility to work around this thing without disabling this flag, or just put a proxy or something in front of it, or some other idea?
Yeah, if anonymous requests are disabled on the API server, we honor that by not allowing any anonymous requests to the API server. The feature was designed so that in cases where you don't actually want discovery clients pulling from your API server, you can host the discovery document somewhere else. So you could have something that connected to the API server in a credentialed way, pulled out like the key set information and the information it would need to build and serve the discovery doc, and then it could serve it from a URL of your choosing. That URL would need to correspond to the issuer URL that you select. But if you have a server that you really don't want to expose to anonymous requests, then choosing a different location to host your discovery documents is probably what you would want to do.
Yeah, I think what this comes down to is, in order to sort of use this feature, you have to sort of coordinate with the person running the API server. You at least in the anonymous case, like if you are able to configure like for example, the endpoint is accessible by default by all service accounts. So if you are able to send a Vera token for like your pod service account, you will be able to read this endpoint. But yeah, if the case is I have a client library that I cannot update and it assumes just anonymous access to this metadata endpoint, yeah, your real only choice is coordination between whoever set up the API server and whoever wants to consume this endpoint. Because no matter what, they would, even if you want to host this thing elsewhere, almost all client libraries, when they ask the issuer, like when they fetch the issuer URL, when they read the document, if the issuer inside the document is not the same as the issuer URL that they expect, they'll fail the request, which is what they're supposed to do. So it really just comes down to you can't necessarily consume this without some coordination between the different parties.
I actually found this when I was trying to connect, for example, one API server to another. So the one API server is actually trusting the other one. And it was not possible because the first, let's say the master API server, which which is going to be trusted by the rest is not. I mean, you cannot actually configure, for example, the kube API server to talk to the discovery endpoint with like bearer token or something like this.
Yeah. So the options there are to allow the discovery doc to be fetched anonymously on the server that you want to point other servers at. That's one option. The other is to host an anonymously accessible discovery endpoint and pull the information you want from whichever API server you consider the authority or the root of trust and construct the docs that would be served from that. I've seen things use like publicly available buckets. You know, there are different options for where you could host that. One nice thing about doing that is it means that your API server is no longer in the critical path for things that want to verify tokens, right? So there are actually some benefits to extracting and hosting the discovery information in maybe a more available or a more accessible location.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll think of something more interesting on how to solve it. Thank you.
Okay, I think all we have left now is the CSR stuff. So I had written this stuff down. I've been kind of thinking and playing around with the CSR API recently. Just kind of going through some things, and I, like Micah, had conversations with you as well, kind of related to EKS. So some of the things that kind of came up to mind, is sort of obvious one. Like the last one is kind of something I wondering if you want to try to address is Mike, if I understand it correctly, in EKS, you guys don't plan on any support for the client cert-based approach, which is perfectly valid. Today, you know, because, or sorry, in older versions of Cube, before we had the signer name, you know, there was sort of no way to indicate that you were going to refuse to sign. The client could just wait for some amount of time and then give up or whatever. And two, like, if you use the default signer, it'll go ahead and sign it if everything is fine, you know, after it's been approved, but it won't work because you've purposely not configured the trust that way. So I've been thinking, like, how do we make the case of, like, I want to use the default signers and I don't want to support a subset of them without necessarily having to, like, wholesale, right? Like basically today, like the easiest thing if you don't want to support a particular signer is wait for David's PR on the like per signer keys and stuff, and give it a key that isn't like trusted with anything, and thus when it signs, it won't work, and it stays out of the way, right? Like, because that requires no code.
Kinder to consumers to just go ahead and create an admission webhook that rejects these, right?
Yeah, so you could have an admission webhook to reject. That is an approach. You can also have a custom signer to deny explicitly, as the new API fields allow you to explicitly say, I refuse to sign this for you. I guess the bit I'm trying to address is, can we, like, make this not require, like, code? Can we just, like, handle the obvious case of, like, here's the built-in signers, and we let you opt out in a coding agnostic way instead of?
I think we already do that, right? The controller is optional. If you don't want the controller, you cannot have it. If you want to reject, I think you could just take an off-the-shelf OPA and add policy to it, right? It's a fairly simple field to check.
Yeah, I guess the thing that hesitates me about admission in this is we don't have we don't have the way to statically configure dynamic admission outside of the API server yet, And so like you would have to deploy it on the API server. Like you would have to create a kube API. And I think there is some desire to have like things that are enforcing on the kube API without literally present in the kube API, kind of like the stuff that's burned into the API server. Like I want to make clear, I don't think any of this involves like V1. Like these are like things I want to sort of polish. I'm not worried about V1 on this.
Being able to flip off individual signers, being able to turn off individual signers doesn't seem terrible. The main one I would actually want to be able to turn off is the legacy signer.
I thought we were removing that one for
in V1. It should just die, right?
It is, you cannot create V1 requests for it.
So it's gone.
However, as long as the V1 once the V1 Beta 1 API is no longer served, we can remove it.
Yeah, so like the way I was thinking about it is like you can choose to use a signer, or you can choose to use a signer but have it configured in a way that it will automatically deny the incoming stuff without signing it, as a way of saying, like, on this platform, this is, yes, we know this is a built-in Kubernetes signer. You might expect it to work, but we are very obviously telling you it will not work here. So, like instead of requesting a client start approving it and getting it back and then trying to use it against the Kube API to see if it works, real close and upfront that like it's not supposed to work.
Well, so I guess I'm trying to figure out what broke along the way to get us here, right? Like these signer names, they can be anything. So in the future, we may choose to add more kube ones. Configuring it so that they actually get signed at all via the stock kube controller manager, even using the stock kube controller manager for some of them, you don't have to sign with anything valid, as you said. You could also simply turn off that entire controller and use some other mechanism to manage it.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm sort of getting at, right? Like it's sort of all or nothing.
I agree with Mo that it's painful to have to write code in order to not do something. That's kind of painful.
I don't mind adding the individual names. Like it's easy to say like, hey, we're going to have individual names for all these controllers. That's pretty easy to do.
Yeah, there's individual names, and then like I think the novel one would be the idea that you can have a controller active, but you're actually telling it not to do its normal job. You're telling it to go.
Well, why would it be active at all, right? Like if you had them separately named, why would you turn on the one for client?
Yeah, you could not turn it. You could make it so it's not turned at all, and then the client would just issue a CSR, and it might even get approved, and then nothing will happen, which is not awesome.
I mean, being able to turn off the signers seems like a straightforward thing to do with a very small surface area. If you wanted to put things into the path that would synchronously inform, like reject via admission, or then that seems like a secondary thing that you might want to go do, but you wouldn't have to do. Like, make simple things simple. Like, I don't want to issue this type of certificate. Like, I think that would probably be easy. We do garbage collect.
It's a day, right?
Non-signed certificates, don't we?
1 day, right? Like I think we wait a day and we show up and delete it.
If you have a lot of nodes and they
they retry,
they retry, it's painful. Ask me how I know.
The nodes should be reusing the same CSRs after they created them. as well.
Yeah.
And we've had bugs where we messed up the hash for some reason, and that was not true. But if it's not true again, we should go and fix it again.
Yeah, so in the normal case, when a node wants a client cert, it will keep requesting the same one. Like, it won't create new objects on every restart. It did at one point, but that was fixed.
Yeah, that was the serving cert for us.
So the things that the inputs changed is what you're saying. So yeah, I guess I would ask, like, kubelets don't do those by default. Like, you have to ask them to rotate and request. Was it an issue where you weren't intending to issue these at all, and
it was
figured, or
I mean, it was partly our own making. Like, we had a custom signer because we didn't want to sign client certs, right? We only wanted to sign serving certs, and then we also in that thought, oh, okay, let's only sign X509 like SANs for domains we can validate on node certs because we're auto approving node certs. So let's strip out the ones that the kubelet that we can't validate that the kubelet asked for, but then the kubelet will re-request a cert if the SAN didn't match what it requested. So it's caused a lot of like pain for us just to have to like have custom code, and then it's not exactly like upstream, and then there's these assumptions that we weren't like aware of, and then we get burned. So that's kind of one of the motivations for us to just be like, we really don't want a custom signer if we can help it.
I think what the specific would be, we don't want a custom signer that implements one of the Kubernetes signers, because we don't necessarily know exactly the contract that the built-in signer did without necessarily just copying the whole code. And then
right, exactly.
Lines.
For the serving certificate feature in particular, I was not promoting that to GA this release because there were, like, the API I think is sufficient now, but some of the things like what you mentioned, like the behavior when the SANs don't match, and like what do we even recommend people do to decide whether they should approve these? Like, we don't have a built-in improver. So I wanted to take some time to get feedback on that. So it sounds like you have good feedback. So maybe we could at least strengthen documentation about like what the behavior is, and then maybe think about ways to make the kubelet not lose its mind. And probably for like 120, if we can tighten that up and document that, and maybe put some safeguards in place.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So, like, for the specific question, I would support being able to individually address the signers that are built into the Kube Controller Manager. I don't have a problem with that. I probably won't have time to go do that, but if someone wanted to do that, I'm not opposed to it. For some of the more sort of involved, like automatically reject with a message, and like, I think I would probably lean on admission types of things, OPA, or types of things for more particular feedback to a user. You asked for a serving cert, and we don't support that because they're crazy to support. Whatever is particular to your environment.
I will say, if someone wants to implement that, I would like to see it be the case that the existing controller name, if someone had tried to disable the CSR controller, I would like that to continue to be honored, which means it's not a perfectly straight replacement, but it's still possible.
on the way we control like the status and improve sub-resource of CSR, you couldn't have like an admission. You could have an admission plugin to deny the CSR, right? Like flat out reject the creation, but you couldn't have it like in request, like update the status to be like the specific denied.
If it denies the creation, then you don't need to update the status.
No, I know. It's more of like the way the API is written, you know, it's more of like you create a CSR and you see based on status that was someone approving or not approving it, right? Now it's more like you create a CSR, if the creation fails, see if the creation like failure reason is one that like is a network error because something's flaky and you retry, or it's like the admission plugin.
Well, I mean,
if the requester and the consumer are different too, like different components, the explicit like deny, like the deny on the request communicates different information than the deny on the object.
The producer and the consumer are different components.
Like if the person requesting the CSR and the consumer of the CSR are different, or if the entities are different.
But I think no matter what you chose to do, you would have to choose one or the other. And so if you're going to write one thing, you could just choose to write something different instead, right? Like if you wanted to allow it to be created, you could just explicitly deny now, right? Like you allow it to be created and then just come in and say, no, this can't be issued or approved.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we probably beat that one to death. Some other stuff that I've been kind of poking around at is I was trying to see like when I asked for a cert from one of the signers how long it would last, and somehow I'd forgotten that the default was 1 year, and I'm trying to figure out one, why we have that really long default, and two, in like what environment is it safe to hand out an irrevocable client cert credential for the API against the API server for a year?
One in which it's very easy to rotate that trust.
Well, sure. That just means that it's actually you're relying on the ability to rotate an entire CA as revocation, right? It's fine. It's just
just asked, right? So, but that's one, right? If it's a push button to say revoke this one and create me a new one.
Well, no, but that revokes all of them.
Yeah.
I know. I don't want to revoke all client certs. Like, I understand I could just make a new CA and then the trust is no longer there and all identities are nuked.
Well, but if you believe they're supposed to be short-lived, everything would re-request. I'm just saying that it's possible today, right? Because it's not all client certs. It's just the client certs that you signed using the CSR client.
Yeah. So I understand that. It's just that like none of that tells me like I should do this as the default, right? Like, that doesn't seem like if you just imagine you have vanilla cube and you're running it, like it'll issue and you either incorrectly or correctly wired up the CA bundles, depending on how you think about it. The default behavior is like I think kubeadm reuses the same CA bundle across like all the stuff, right? So if you do that, you're not gonna you're not gonna rotate the CA because you actually do nuke all client server credentials, right? So like how do we make like the default like sane and safe? Like in my head, I'm trying to figure out like how we make this foot gun not so obviously broken.
What do you think a safe default length would be?
So I think for kubelets, we can make it relatively short. One, because we have the rotation and all that, and we have like admission and authorizer. Like we have all these pieces in place to like make kubelets like not dangerous to us, if some fancy word. Arbitrary identities are like, I don't know.
Why wouldn't we control it by the deployment mechanism stance, right? Like for instance, a deployment mechanism could say, I only want these to live for 2 weeks. and that's just my stance. A different deployer could decide, you know what, I like the idea of a year, so I'm going to make my stuff last for 2 years.
But so that part is fine, David. It's more of like today, if you do nothing, you choose a year with no necessarily understanding of what that means, right? I think very few people would actually feel comfortable if you told them that this API lets you issue out credentials that are irrevocable and they last for a year. Right? Like that, I think, is probably not what people would expect to happen. Right? And like, so like I don't remember what we did in OpenShift. Is it a month, David? Is that what we
It's a month, right? But we also recognize that they aren't irrevocable, right? Like you're claiming they are. You can't individually revoke them.
Yeah,
but if you have
that's
a
what I
problem,
mean.
you can. It's also the stance of the platform though. Like if you give a signer that can sign for a year, like, okay.
No, it's more of like by default, if you do nothing, you make a signer that can sign for a year, right? Like I want to issue serving certs for my kubernetes. Oh, I also now serve client certs for end users for the same length, right? Like the durations don't make any sense to me. Like honestly, to a certain degree, I would say the duration should be like a second, and then the person has to go configure it for that controller, like explicitly. Like it has to be so small that like unless you configure it yourself to some value that you have actually understood it, like decided what the risk is to your environment. Like I just don't think people make that choice because they don't even understand what they're choosing. Like I know people on this SIG understand that. Like that's not like sort of what I'm going for, right? And I do, and I'm basing this on like poking around at various like offerings of Kubernetes, right? Like other than OpenShift, all of them last in the measurements of years, right? Using the same CA that the rest of the system uses.
I guess I wouldn't second guess someone else's security stance for what they chose.
The fact that it's a default probably, well, it means that it frequently is not considered.
Choosing something short-ish has repercussions, right? Like you noted OpenShift, right? There's a lot of things that don't like the idea that their creds have to be refreshed.
Right, and like
we found them.
Well, sure, I know we found them painfully. David, you found them. I know. I hid behind you to make sure that I didn't get all the pitchforks. I fairly admit this. Thank you for that, David. Like, so I know in traditional like CA infrastructures, the signer always controls the length, right? And certainly, I think it should always control the max length because it gets to decide whatever it's comfortable with. But like, is there a space for a client to say and really what I mean a client here is I mean a client that's provisioning credentials for someone else almost certainly is, can I have something shorter? Because I'm happy that you think a year is fine or 4 years is fine or 5 years is fine or a month is fine, but I want like 2 weeks because like that's better for me. Like,
well, you get to choose the lifespan of the certificate you provide, right? Like you're saying you want to have a certificate that is valid for a very long time and a signature on it is valid for a shorter time?
What do you mean, David?
The CSR cannot imply a TTL.
Or doesn't embed an expiration.
Like that's the crux of it, right? I want to ask the signer, I understand that you will always limit me to whatever your max length is, but I also don't want one for longer than a week because I personally in this particular flow don't trust that, right? And if the answer is in any of those cases you must go build a custom signer and somehow like I don't know, put an annotation on the CSR when you create it and the custom signer observes that and does something. I mean that like in that world I rather just the client serving ones just not be enabled by default like ever. Like you must explicitly enable them and opt into using them and understand what their properties are, because they're just dangerous.
So the nice thing about rotating the route is that you can pause it if, for whatever reason, rotation infrastructure is broken. You can wait for all clients to re-provision certs and then make a decision to go or no go based on having a ticking time bomb with either CRLs or short-lived certs. There's definitely a happy medium in there, but too low and you're really cutting into what you can actually support if PKI goes down.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, Mike, what you're referring to is like the epoch approach, right? That Google has in a lot of its CI infrastructure, right? Your system coasts when the infrastructure is down because the epoch hasn't changed, so all the certs for a particular epoch are still valid, right?
Yeah, it's basically equivalent to routes signed for 10 years that rotate every couple days.
Yeah, I mean, like maybe if Cube did that by like default somehow, like if
Right.
it actually like you know, it asked for a CA bundle that was supposed to be, or sorry, it asked for a root private key that was supposed to be good for forever, and it issued like, you know, very long-lived credentials, but it constantly was changing the epoch to based on some criteria, sure, right? But like I'm more looking at this as like how do you make the system safe for like non-TLS experts to run, right? Like people should be able to deploy Cube without learning all this.
I mean, it is a month. Does a month have dramatically different security properties than a year in the event of a compromise, credential loss case where you need to invalidate a credential? I'm not sure it does.
Probably
Like,
does not.
there's a week, like when you get down to like a week, that starts to get short enough that like a disruption in your controller on the order of days can actually cause availability problems. Like I feel like to make it short enough to be meaningful, it also is short enough that it starts to have noticeable implications for availability and operations. So I'm not, like, I hear what you're saying,
right, and
but I'm also not sure what the right value is.
Right, and I think the problem is there is no right value. It's the value that is correct is based on who submitted the CSR. Right? I trust this entity to have a longer cert because I have vetted that identity in some other way that I am happy with. Right? I issued this to this unprotected edge component that like someone could easily break into. Okay, he needs to figure out a better rotation strategy because I refuse to give him longer certs. Like, he doesn't get to have a year. He has, if he goes down for more than a week, then someone's gonna have to go fix him. Right, like that's what I think comes down to is like we're saying it's the responsibility of the signer, but the built-in signers are basically brain dead when it comes to doing anything reasonable on the plane. Right, so if you know, you can imagine that I could use all the built-in signers, and if I had a field that was enforcing the max bound of TTL, I could have an admission plugin that says, okay, when Mo requests a cert for serving cert for his app, it can only be like for like a week. He can't ask for years and crazy crap, right? That I can see, like, you know, you could even write an OPA policy to go default it and do something nice, all those things, right? Like
so are you asking us to change the default, or are you asking for a field to specify something different?
I am asking for something better than what we do today. I was stating various options that we had, that none of them are necessarily super compelling, but what we have today seems extremely uncompelling and unsafe. Like, I feel like the CIS benchmark should say you should go make sure you turn off these signers, like always, because they're just not smart enough to do something useful
feel like the reason why I'm in favor of adding a field to the API, I know we're at the end of time here, is I'm having trouble convincing myself that the people that would issue certs would always be the ones that are able to click a button that says rotate this CA. Like, I feel like there is a persona that doesn't have the ability to rotate the CA in the cluster, but does have the ability to issue certs with the CSR API. And so they want to be able to like cover themselves if they issue a cert to a edge node like Mo is talking about.
I know we are out of time. I'd be interested in thinking through like if this belongs in to the requester or the approver, like where in that flow that belongs. Mo, would you mind opening like an issue to maybe dump some of these thoughts into, and can
yeah, I had meant to do that. I apologize, I haven't done so yet. But yeah, I all the issues, even the ones that we didn't cover, I will probably make just like individual issues for those. Kind of try to keep them separate because I think they are pretty distinct. But yeah, I don't think any of this affects V1 work for CSR. I just as I think through it, there's some sharp edges on some of this stuff that aren't sort of awesome.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We will see you in 2 weeks.